Hello friends, welcome to my channel and explore the world of Microsoft Azure. My name is Rajneesh Kaushik and I'm a Microsoft certified trainer, consultant and an enterprise architect. For more latest videos and blogs, you can always log into my website rajneeshkaushik.com and subscribe to my blog. Please do not forget to subscribe my channel and click the bell icon so you don't miss the latest videos. Do like, share and comment. Today, we are going to learn how do we design secure access to the Azure services. So let's get started. This is the agenda item. First, we will understand what are the security concerns when any Azure services is accessed by default. Then we will learn about two key concepts, Azure Private Endpoint and Azure Private Link services. And finally, we will understand private link workflow, and then we will uh, we will go through a demo to demonstrate these concepts. Okay, so what are the security issues whenever any service is created in Azure and you want to access that services by default? What does it mean? It means that, for example, if suppose you have created a SQL server and in the SQL server you want to access the SQL server with the Azure VM, and you directly access any of the resource. This example I have shown you SQL Server, but it can be Azure Blob Storage or Azure Synapse, right? So whenever you try to access these Azure services, the access to these services, the connectivity to these services goes via the public internet. And if you are storing any confidential data or PII data or sensitive data, and your connection is going via the public internet, it's not going to be secure because you are anyway exposing your connectivity via the public internet where there are chances that it can be hacked. So that is why it is not a best practice. So then what is the best practice and how do we overcome this issue? So let's learn this. How do we overcome this issue? In order to understand that, first we will understand the concept of Azure Private Endpoint and Azure Private Link Service. So what is private endpoint? Private endpoint is a nothing but a network interface. Okay, and when I say network interface, it means that suppose you create a virtual machine in a VNet, then that virtual machine has a network interface, so that this virtual machine can communicate to the internet via that NIC card or network interface. Okay, so similarly, whenever you create a private endpoint, okay, this private endpoint is nothing but a network interface, and it is created within the virtual network, okay, which means that it is going to get one IP address from the virtual network address space, okay, so that the machine can communicate via the private endpoint. Okay, so it is in a layman's term, you can understand it as a network interface which is within the VNet address space, or it has its own IP address, and this VM can connect to the private endpoint or network interface, and then the connectivity, instead of going the connectivity via the public internet, the connectivity goes via the private endpoint. Okay, so what are the advantages of this approach? That the Azure resource here, this Azure resource, is a part of your virtual network. Okay, because it is nothing but a NIC, network interface. Okay, and the connectivity which goes to the resource Azure services goes via the Microsoft Azure backbone. Okay, Microsoft has its own Azure backbone internet, backbone network, and that is secure. That means it is not going via the public internet. Okay, and if it is not going via the public internet, that means you are making it more and more secure. So this is the advantage of using a private endpoint. Now, just creating private endpoint does not help much because it is just a IP address which is assigned to you on the virtual machine, so that virtual machine can start connecting. So in order for us to connect from this virtual machine to the Azure resources, we need another construct called Azure Private Link. And let's understand what is this Azure Private Link. So in order to understand it, we have I've just created this diagram. So in this, suppose you have your on-premises environment. You are connecting this on-premises environment via the express route to the Azure data center. In Azure data center, you have a VM, and this VM wants to connect to a web application which is hosted um, in these VMs. And obviously, this is load balanced by the load balancer, standard load balancer. Okay, and you want to access this VM, the web application hosted in this behind the load balancer privately instead of going via the public internet. So this is the scenario, right? And we will understand how we can implement it with a private link. Okay, so this virtual machine wants to access web application behind the Azure load balancer, and we already created a private endpoint. That means we already created a network interface. Okay, now when we create a network interface, what happens? We'll create a private link. Okay, and private link is nothing but it is a network connection between this private endpoint and the Azure resource. In this scenario, we are using the services behind the load balancer, which is web application. So it creates a private link, and this private link connectivity goes via the Azure backbone again, instead of going via the uh, public internet. Now this private link here, it receives the connections from multiple endpoints. So in this scenario, this is one of the endpoint. There might be another consumer who want to access this service. So there might be another endpoint. And this routes the traffic to the load balancer, which in turn route the traffic to the particular VM. And then the traffic comes back in the same route. So the advantage of this approach is that instead of using public internet, it is going via the private link, which uses Microsoft Azure Backbone network. Okay. Now, what is the advantage of this approach? We can integrate your all the on-premises and the peer network here. So in this scenario, if you see, this can be any on-premises network as well or any peer network, right? And that network can access directly all the services to the via the private link. And in case of any security incidents, okay, within your network, suppose there is some security flaw, some security breach happened in your network, then only these mapped resources would be accessible. Okay, that means you are reducing the attack surface because only the mapped resources will be accessible, right? So that means you are reducing the attack surface, and it is not going to impact everything, right? And the most important part is that your traffic is going to go on the Microsoft network without any public access. That means it is more secure. So what is the flow of it, how it works, right? So on the left side, it is service consumers, okay, and the right side it is service provider. Service provider is, in this example, we have taken, you have configured a application which is behind the scene running in the VMs, and you are using a standard load balancer. Now you created a private link service, and you attach this private link to the load balancer as we have seen in the diagram. Then you share this private link service ID. Service ID is nothing but a resource URI, okay, which is in a specific format in Azure with your consumers, so that these consumer can try to access this resource via the resource ID, because the resource ID is unique. So consumer need to know which resource they are trying to connect. Okay, so there are two ways you can provide this resource ID. Either you can advertise it or you can manually send it to the resource. Then once this resource IDs are known, the consumers create their own private endpoints. Okay, and while creating their private endpoint, they specify the private link service ID, which they have received on the step number 3. So they map this private endpoint to the private link service ID. Once they map it, then the connectivity starts. But in order for your resource to connect to this service load balancer, um, for the you need to point the DNS record so that it can be easy for the resources to access the service, right? Otherwise, it can use the IP address as well. But instead of using IP address, you want to give it a name and then provide that name to access that service. So that is why it is a good practice to configure the DNS for this. So that whenever, suppose in this example, you are going to access this web application with some host name, then you will create a DNS record for that host name so that this application can be accessed with that host name in the VNet. Once that is done, then request is sent to the provider. That means this provider, and then the provider says yes, the connection is secure. I am approving it, so it approves that. Once the approval is sent, connection is approved, or if it is rejected, then connection is rejected. If it is rejected, you won't be able to access the resource. If it is approved, then you are able to access the resource. So in this way, it is more secure, right? It is not something like you open the endpoint and anybody can access it. It is approval or rejection workflow is already inbuilt into the service. Let's understand this concept with a demo. So in this demo, we are going to create a VNet, and then we're going to create a base station host so that we can securely access the VM. Then we will deploy a VM, and this VM will be accessible with the base station host. We will create a Azure web app, and then we will create private endpoint and private link service. So why we want to create private endpoint and private link services? By default, Azure web app is accessible via the public internet. Okay, and this is the default way of accessing Azure web app. But we don't want to make it accessible via the public internet. Instead, we want to make it accessible with the privately from a VM. So for this, we are going to deploy private endpoint and private link service. And then we will create a DNS record or DNS zone so that this web application can be pointed to that IP address. Okay. And once that is done, then we are going to access this Azure web apps from this VM, and we will see that this Azure web app is no more accessible on the public internet access. It is getting access with the private IP address, which is created within the Azure VNet address range. So this is the demo, and we will test the connectivity with the private endpoint. We'll do the NS lookup and see what is the IP address of that VM. So let's jump to the code. Here is the code. We are going to connect to the Azure with the Connect EZ account. We'll create a private endpoint demo resource group, and this resource group we are going to create all these variables. That means the VNet name is demo VNet, location is East US, web application web app name is demo web app, and the resource group, which is web app resource group, is created where this web app will be hosted inside the resource group. Then we create a subnet, and then we create a base station network, and this is a VNet parameters for the, because we first need to create a VNet where this resource is going to be hosted. So once that is done, this is the address prefix of the VNet, and this is a subnet. So VNet is created here with Azure new AZ virtual network. We create a public IP address for the base station host because this is a standard way you want to access it. So we are going to, these are the parameters we are using for public IP address parameters, and this is a public IP address parameter commandlet new AZ public IP address. Then we create a base station parameters, and then we create a base station Azure base station. Then here we create a VM. For VM, first we create a credential of the VM, and then we create a first get the virtual network which we already created before, get the reference to that virtual network. Then we create a NIC parameter for the VM so that this virtual NIC interface can be used to connect to the VM. And once that network interface is done, we create a VM. For VM, you know, VM size and name is required. So size and name parameter, credentials parameter, and SKU we are using Windows 2019 data center edition, latest edition. So these are the parameters. These are the standard way of creating any VM, right? Then we create a first VM config before we create a VM, and then we create a new VM with this config. So first we create a config. In the config we provide all the parameters. Then we create a VM, and once we have the VM, we create a web app. So this web app will be created in the web app resource group, and the web app name is this demo web app, which we already set up in the initial part of the code. And then we create a private endpoint connection here. So first we create a private link, and private link for this particular web application, we create a private link. Okay, and once you have the private link, then you start creating the private endpoint. So this is a private endpoint, and in this private endpoint you are mapping this private endpoint with the private link connection, because they need to map, otherwise this is not going to work. So you map this. So these are the parameters, and then we create a private endpoint. So once the private endpoint is created, um, we now set up the zone, DNS zone. Why DNS zone? Because whenever you create a web application, the web application with their host name, like in this example, demo web application, it will not be accessible directly. If you create a DNS host, DNS, you don't have to specify the IP address. You can specify the name of the web application. It will automatically resolve to that IP address. So that is why we create this DNS zone. Once this DNS zone is created, we assign this private link to the DNS zone on that virtual network. So which means that it will get the IP address from that VNet, and then create a link to the private link, and um, then all setup is done. This is a DNS config parameter. That means this is the name of the particular naming convention. Like for all the Azure resources, you need to use these are the config. Like for private link dot Azure website dot net, or for other blob resources, there is a very specific naming like this private link dot Azure blob dot net, something like that. So there are these specific DNS config names. Once this is done, then this is pretty straightforward. You create a DNS zone. In the DNS zone, once the zone is created, you are good to go. So now let's see it working. Okay, so for this I have already created a this is my VM. In this VM, if you see, this is my web application. This is the name of my web application, PE private endpoint demo web app dot azure website dot net. And if you go here and do ns lookup, you will see that this application is now accessible with this 10.0.0.5. That means it is accessing privately. It is not going by the public IP address. And if you access this application here, this is the application. This is the by default whenever you set up any Azure web app. This is the first page it shows you by default. So that means our application is going via the private internet instead of going with the public. It is going via the Microsoft Azure backbone, and it is using the private IP address, not the public access. So this way you can secure it. And let me show you all other resources. Like in this example, this is a web application which we have created. Then this is a DNS zone. One second, private DNS zones. Yeah, here is a private DNS zone I was telling you. This particular IP address is actually pointing to this particular names. Okay, so then whenever you access this, it will go to this particular name. So here is a linkage which we established. Similarly, there is this. These are the resources: base station IP address, public IP address of base station network, base station host. This is the VM which is being accessed by the base station, and this is a demo VNet. and private endpoints. So let's see. This is a demo VNet, and this is a actually the VM NIC interface. This is a as I explained you, private endpoint is nothing but a network interface. So this is the network interface which is created, and this network interface is actually a part of your subnet which you have created in this zone. So this is a part of this subnets, and whenever you use any device within that subnet, it is going to access the web application. Okay, so this is your private endpoint, and this is the private link. Private link is now being used for accessing your resource, which is nothing but Azure App Service.
Thanks for watching and do not forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon to